The prairie wind carried the faint scent of rain that evening. Brushing across the tall grass like a whisper from another world, the sun hung low, painting the sky with gold and crimson hues that seemed to set the land itself on fire. She stood at the edge of the small settlement, her hands resting on the worn fence rail, watching the distant shapes of riders moving along the horizon. Among them rode the Apache king and his people, proud, silent, and bound to a world that most settlers barely understood. But that day, all eyes weren't on the king. They were on his son, the one everyone called the Silent Wolf. The young man rode slightly behind his father, straight-backed and strong, yet separated by more than distance. The settlers' children stared and whispered. Some laughed. The traders turned their heads away when he passed. Even among his own people, few spoke to him. His silence unsettled them, though it wasn't his choice. He had been born without a voice, in a world where warriors sang before battle and shouted their victories to the sky. Yeah, man without words was seen as half alive. But she saw more. She always had. From the first time she glimpsed him near the river. His dark hair gleaming under the sun, she noticed the stillness in him, not weakness, but strength waiting for a place to belong. The other settlers whispered stories about him. Some said the mute son had been cursed by spirits. Others claimed he refused to speak because of some deep guilt tied to his tribe's battles with the army years ago. She didn't believe any of it. To her, he didn't seem cursed. He seemed misunderstood, like the land itself, wild and full of secrets that few cared to learn. Life on the frontier didn't leave much room for compassion. Each day was a battle against hunger, against loneliness, against the past. Yet somehow, every time she saw the Apache sun, something stirred in her chest, something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It was connection. The kind that made her forget the invisible line dividing her people from his, when their paths crossed again. It was by accident or maybe fate. The spring floods had carried half the settlement's fence posts into the ravine, and she had gone down alone to retrieve them. The earth was still slick from rain, her boots sinking into the mud. One wrong step sent her tumbling down the slope, the world spinning until she hit the bottom hard enough to lose her breath. Pain shot through her ankle, sharp and sudden. Before she could cry out, shadow fell over her. He was there, the Silent Wolf. His bare chest glistened under the filtered sunlight, muscles tightening as he crouched beside her. His eyes met hers, steady and searching, and she realized that silence had its own language. Without saying a word, he tore a strip from the cloth around his waist and wrapped her ankle. His movements careful, deliberate. She tried to thank him, her voice trembling with more than pain. But he only shook his head softly, as if words didn't matter. When he lifted her into his arms to carry her back to the path, she felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. The air between them seemed to hum with something ancient. Not romance yet, but recognition. The world around them was divided by fear and hatred, but in that moment, none of it seemed real. Back in town, though reality came crashing back, the townsfolk watched as he carried her across the street, their eyes wide with judgment. Whispers spread faster than wildfire. An Apache had touched one of their own. The sheriff stepped forward, his hand resting near his gun, but the king's son didn't flinch. He set her down gently on the porch and turned to leave. She tried to call after him, but again he raised a hand, not in anger, but in farewell. That night, she couldn't sleep. The rain came again, drumming softly on the roof as memories of his eyes haunted her. She wondered what his voice might sound like if he had one, if the stars had stolen it the day he was born. She wanted to know his thoughts, his story, the dreams that must have lived behind that calm, unreadable face. And then, without fully understanding why, she began to learn. She started practicing the gestures used by the nearby tribes, hand signs that hunters used to speak across distance, the simple movements that could form meaning without sound. It became her secret habit. Every night, by the dim light of her oil lamp, she traced the shapes in the air, teaching her fingers to talk where her tongue could not. Weeks passed before she saw him again. This time it was at the trading post, where his people had come to exchange skins and beads for tools. The other settlers avoided him, stepping aside as though his silence might spread like disease. But she didn't. Her heart pounded as she walked toward him, her hands trembling. When he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. She slowly raised her hands and signed a greeting she had practiced 100 times in secret. His eyes widened, the smallest flicker of surprise breaking through his stoic calm. Then, for the first time, he smiled. Not a broad grin, but a faint, genuine curve that spoke of disbelief and wonder all at once. He lifted his own hand and replied with a single, graceful motion, "You understand." In that moment, the world around them disappeared. The traders' voices, the wind, the distant creak of wagon wheels, all faded into nothing. It was as if they stood alone at the edge of two worlds. And for the first time, a bridge was being built between them. But not everyone saw it that way. The sheriff watched from the doorway, his jaw tight. Others muttered that the girl had lost her mind, that she was consorting with savages. Rumors spread, cruel and fast, twisting something pure into something shameful. She didn't care. The language of hands was something no one could take from her, or from him. Over the following days, they met again by the river. Sometimes they didn't need signs at all. They just sat in silence, listening to the wind in the reeds. She learned that silence could hold more meaning than speech, that kindness, trust, and even affection didn't always need sound to exist. And yet, she also sensed the danger in their growing closeness. The world they lived in had no mercy for hearts that defied its rules. One afternoon, as the sky darkened with the promise of another storm, he arrived with urgency in his eyes. His hands moved rapidly, telling her something she couldn't fully grasp. Danger. Soldiers. Something about his tribe. She reached for him, trying to steady his shaking hands so she could understand. But before he could finish, a gunshot rang out in the distance. He turned sharply toward the sound, his expression shifting from fear to fury. She stood frozen, the wind whipping her hair, as she watched him mount his horse and ride toward the rising smoke on the horizon. She called out, but he didn't hear her, or maybe he couldn't. The storm broke open above them, thunder rolling across the land as rain fell hard and fast. Blurring his shape until he vanished into the chaos, she stood there, soaked to the bone, staring into the dark distance where he had disappeared. Her heart pounded with dread and something else, realization. The quiet connection they had built, the fragile bond formed in gestures and silence, was about to be tested in a way neither of them had imagined. And as lightning split the sky, she whispered to herself, "He can't face this alone." Then she gathered her shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the storm, not knowing whether she was running toward him or into a danger that would change both their worlds forever. The storm didn't stop her. Each step through the mud felt heavier than the last, but the thought of him kept her moving. The rain blurred everything around her, turning the land into shifting shades of gray. She followed the tracks his horse had left in the soft ground, broken only by the rush of water spilling down the hillside. Somewhere ahead, she heard faint shouts and the crack of gunfire. Her heart clenched. The settlers had always feared the Apaches. Fear made men reckless. By the time she reached the ridge overlooking the river valley, smoke curled through the rain. Below, a small camp burned, one of the Apache outposts, a cluster of hide tents and wooden frames. She saw figures moving through the haze, some running, others dragging the wounded to safety. Then, through the storm's noise, she saw him. The silent wolf was fighting off two men near the edge of the camp, moving with fierce precision. His long hair clung to his shoulders, soaked and dark as night, and his bare arms swung with the strength of someone defending more than his life. She froze, torn between fear and awe. The settlers had brought their rifles. She recognized a few faces from town, men who traded at her father's store. They looked desperate, their eyes wild with the same fear she had seen before every war story. The rain hissed against the barrels of their guns as they aimed toward the river, where the Apache warriors regrouped to defend what was left of their camp. She wanted to shout at them to stop, to remind them that these were people, not ghosts of war. But no one would have listened. Not to a woman. Not tonight. Suddenly, a horse burst from the thicket, riderless and terrified. The sight drew her back to the present. She needed to reach him before things went worse. She stumbled down the slope, her skirt heavy with rainwater, her boots sinking in the mud. When she reached the outer tents, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and wet earth. She saw an old woman kneeling beside a fallen man, whispering prayers in a language she didn't know. The moment their eyes met, the woman didn't scowl or threaten Hirsch. She simply pointed toward the river where the silent wolf now stood on the bank. Facing the advancing settlers alone, she didn't think. She just ran. When she reached him, he turned sharply, ready to defend, until he recognized her through the downpour. His expression changed, though his eyes still burned with tension. She raised her hands, signing quickly, asking him what happened, what she could do. His replies came faster than she could understand, his fingers trembling as he tried to explain. She caught only fragment soldiers, a misunderstanding, a sacred ground they had crossed. She didn't need the full story to see the truth. Fear had started it, and fear, once unleashed, was almost impossible to stop. He motioned for her to leave, his gestures clear, his face pleading. But she refused. She pointed toward the settlers on the ridge, trying to sign that she could talk to them, explain, calm things down. He shook his head, stepping between her and the guns. The moment felt suspended, the air charged with something bigger than both of them. He wasn't just fighting for his people now. He was fighting to protect her too. The crack of another rifle broke the stillness. A bullet tore through the air, striking the ground near his feet. She gasped as he pulled her down, shielding her with his body. The world went white with lightning, the smell of powder sharp in the air. She could feel the strength in his arms as he held her close, waiting for the noise to fade. When the echoes finally died, the valley went silent except for the rain. The settlers were retreating, maybe believing they had made their point. The Apache King's riders were already emerging from the shadows, circling the burned camp, their faces unreadable. The silent wolf stood, still holding her hand as if afraid to let go. When his father arrived, the tension in the air deepened. The king was tall, proud, and his face bore the scars of too many wars. His eyes narrowed when they fell on her. She could feel the weight of his judgment, and even without words she knew what he was thinking. This girl didn't belong here. She was one of them, the settlers who had brought pain to his people. But before she could step back, the mute son signed something to his father. The older man's gaze softened slightly, though his expression stayed guarded. A few other warriors murmured among themselves, glancing between her and the smoldering tents. One of them handed the silent wolf a bow and spoke quietly in their language. He nodded once and turned back to her. His hand brushed hers again, a silent goodbye, and he motioned for her to leave. She wanted to protest, to say she couldn't just walk away after what she'd seen, but his eyes told her there was no choice. That night, when she returned to the settlement, she was met with suspicion and whispers. They wanted to know where she had gone, what she had seen. Some accused her of helping the Apaches. The sheriff warned her to stay clear of those people, claiming the army might come soon to deal with the raids. She tried to tell them it wasn't a raid, that the settlers had crossed sacred land by mistake, but no one wanted to listen. It was easier for them to hold on to their hate than to face their own guilt. For days after, she kept to herself, haunted by the memory of his face in the rain. Every sound of thunder reminded her of that night. She wondered if he was safe, if his people had rebuilt what was lost. Then one morning, she found something on the fence post outside her cabin, a small carved token shaped like a hand. It was smooth and polished with faint symbols etched across the palm. She knew immediately who it was from. From that day, she began to sneak out to the river at dusk. At first, there was no sign of him. Then one evening, as the sky turned orange, he appeared on the opposite bank. The sight of him made her heart race. He raised his hand in greeting the same way she had the first time they met at the trading post. Slowly, she signed a few words across the water, telling him she had missed him, that she was sorry for what had happened. He replied with a calm gesture. It wasn't her fault. They began meeting there in secret, always at twilight. Sometimes they spoke in signs, sometimes in silence, just watching the world settle into night. He began to teach her more of his language, showing her symbols drawn in the dirt or on pieces of bark. Through his gestures, she learned about his mother, who had died during a winter raid, about the scars the white soldiers had left on their lands, about the time he had tried to speak and failed, and how the world had never stopped reminding him of it. But he also showed her other things: how to read the river's flow, how to listen to the wind before it turned, how to see the hidden patterns in the stars. Each night they met, she felt the distance between their worlds shrink a little more. Yet, even as their bond deepened, danger crept closer. The settlers were growing restless again. The loss of cattle, the fear of revenge, the endless cycle of blame, it all pointed toward another conflict. And in town, people had begun to notice her absences. One evening, the sheriff himself came knocking on her door. He warned her that the army scouts were expected soon, and that anyone caught near the Apache lands would be questioned. His eyes lingered on her in a way that made her uneasy, as if he already knew where she had been. After he left, she packed a small bag just in case. Something told her the calm between them and the tribe was about to break. The next day, she went to the river again. But this time, he wasn't there. The woods were still, the air thick with a strange tension. On the far bank, she saw smoke curling above the trees, too much to be from a campfire. Her heart tightened. She climbed down the bank and crossed the shallow stream, ignoring the cold that bit at her legs. When she reached the other side, she found signs of struggle footprints, broken branches, and a single arrow lodged in a fallen log. She picked it up, her hands trembling. The sound of horses carried through the trees, and she ducked behind a rock just as two riders passed. They weren't from the tribe. Their uniforms were blue. Soldiers. She waited until they were gone before stepping out again, fear knotting in her stomach. The world she had known was shifting fast, and she could feel it, the calm before something irreversible. She clutched the carved token hanging from her neck and looked toward the smoke rising higher beyond the ridge. She didn't know what waited there, but she knew one thing for certain. The silent wolf was in danger, and this time she wouldn't stand by and watch. With the storm clouds gathering once more, she took a deep breath, tightened her shawl, and stepped toward the rising smoke, not knowing that what she was about to uncover would change not only her fate, but the fragile peace between both worlds. The forest was darker than she remembered. Every branch seemed to reach out to stop her. Every sound felt sharper. The air carried the faint smell of smoke mixed with wet pine, and her heart pounded as she followed the faint trail toward the ridge. The memory of the night she first met him in the rain played over in her mind, but this time there was no warmth or calm in the air. The silence felt heavy now, filled with the kind of danger that hid behind calm skies. When she reached the clearing, she saw what she had feared. A camp had been attacked. Charred remains of tents and scattered tools lay across the ground. The markings on the ground showed that a fight had taken place. Some of the tracks were deep and wide, made by heavy boots, not moccasins. Soldiers had been here. She knelt near a broken arrow half buried in the mud. The tip was stained dark, and beside it was something else, a bracelet she recognized. Small, carved beads strung together with a leather cord. The same kind he wore on his wrist. Her chest tightened. Before she could take another step, a noise came from behind the rocks. She turned sharply, ready to run, but stopped when she saw a familiar face. It was one of the Apache women she had seen before, older, with silver streaks through her hair. The woman's eyes were sharp, but not unkind. She motioned for her to follow. Without a word, she led her down a narrow path through the trees until they reached a hidden hollow where a few members of the tribe had gathered. The silent wolf wasn't there, but his father was. The Apache king stood beside a small fire, his face shadowed by the flickering light. The warriors around him spoke in low tones, their eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and fury. When the old woman brought her forward, the men fell silent. The king looked at her for a long time before finally speaking in broken English, his voice deep and rough. "You should not be here," he said. "Your people did this." She shook her head, her voice trembling. "Not all of us," she said. "I came to warn you. Soldiers are coming again. They think your tribe took cattle. They want revenge." A murmur spread among the warriors. The king's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. He spoke to his men in his language, and they replied with short, tense phrases. Then he turned back to her. "You know where they come from?" he asked. She nodded. "From the fort near the valley. They'll be here by morning." The king's jaw tightened. "They took my son," he said finally. The words hit her like a strike to the chest. "They take him because he tried to stop fight. They think he is scout, spy. He cannot speak to defend himself." The air seemed to vanish from her lungs. The thought of him, captured and surrounded by soldiers, who saw him as nothing more than a threat, filled her with dread. "Then we have to get him out," she said, "before they take him farther." The king studied her, his face unreadable. "Why you care?" he asked. She swallowed hard, her voice soft but firm. "Because he saved me once. And because he doesn't belong in chains? You know that." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the king nodded slowly. "If you go alone," he said. "My men stay. We protect our people. The soldiers watch every path. But you, they may not stop." She looked at the firelight dancing on his face and saw something in his eyes. Not trust, but respect. It was enough. That night, as the wind howled across the canyon, she made her way toward the fort. The moon hung low, and the path was rough, but she knew the land better than most settlers. Sound made her flinch, afraid it might be a patrol. When she finally reached the ridge overlooking the army camp, she saw the glow of lanterns below and the faint shapes of men moving near the tents. Her gaze stopped on one corner of the camp, where a small cage made of rough wood stood. Inside, barely visible, was a figure sitting in the shadows. She knew it was him. The sight filled her with both relief and pain. He was alive but bound, his hair tangled and his skin bruised. She waited, watching the guards. Two men sat near the fire, talking quietly, rifles resting beside them. She knew she couldn't sneak past both. Her heart raced as she tried to think. Then, from the edge of the camp, a group of riders arrived. Among them was the sheriff. He dismounted and spoke to one of the officers, his tone sharp. She strained to hear, but the wind carried only fragments. "Apache boy. Interrogation. Dawn." She couldn't wait until dawn. Her plan came together faster than she had time to doubt it. She moved back into the trees, searching for something she could use. She found an abandoned cart, a short distance away, half broken and covered with old sacks. With shaking hands, she tore strips from her skirt and soaked them in oil from a lantern left behind. Then she struck a match. Flame roared to life, small at first, then brighter as she pushed the cart toward the edge of the camp. When the fire caught the sacks, the light flared against the night sky. Shouts erupted as soldiers ran toward it, their attention pulled away. She slipped through the darkness, keeping low until she reached the cage. He lifted his head the moment he saw her. His eyes widened with disbelief. She pressed a finger to her lips and worked quickly at the lock with a small piece of wire. She had carried since her father's store days. It took longer than she hoped, every click echoing louder than thunder in her ears. When the lock finally gave way, she pulled the door open. He stepped out, his movements slow but steady. The ropes around his wrists were tight, and she cut through them with a small blade. His hands trembled, but his eyes stayed fixed on her. He signed something fast. "Danger. Go now." She nodded, taking his arm, and they slipped toward the tree line. Behind them, the fire blazed higher. Voices shouted. Orders rang out. The sheriff's voice carried above the chaos, calling for horses. They ran, their breath sharp and quick, feet pounding against the earth. The forest swallowed them, the darkness closing in like a shield. They didn't stop until the campfires were distant glimmers behind them. At last, they collapsed near the river, gasping for air. He leaned against a tree, his chest rising and falling in deep, tired breaths. She reached for his hands and signed slowly, asking if he was hurt. He shook his head, then hesitated before signing back. "Thank you," she smiled, though her hands still shook. For a moment, it felt like they had escaped. But even in the quiet, she knew it wasn't over. The soldiers would search at dawn. The sheriff would not rest until he found them. The settlers in town would turn against her once they learned what she had done. He seemed to sense her fear. He reached out, his hand brushing lightly against hers. Then he signed something she had never seen before, a phrase she didn't understand. She tilted her head, and he drew a shape in the dirt between them. A symbol that looked like two paths crossing into one. He pointed to her, then to himself. It didn't need translation. They followed the river through the night, heading toward the deeper forest, where the Apache tribe had hidden before. The journey was slow. His injuries made it hard for him to move quickly, and the cold water from the river stung their skin. Still, they pressed on. At dawn, they found a small cave hidden beneath a cluster of rocks. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. While he rested, she sat near the entrance, listening to the faint echoes of riders in the distance. She knew they didn't have much time. The soldiers would find the burned wagon, the tracks by the river, and they would come this way. Her mind raced with what to do next. She couldn't bring him back to the settlement, and she didn't know if his people would forgive her for bringing danger to their doorstep. But when she looked back at him, asleep with the faint light brushing his face, she knew she couldn't turn away. Outside, the wind carried the first notes of morning distant hooves, the cry of a hawk. The world was waking, and with it came the weight of choices neither of them could undo. She turned her gaze toward the forest path, feeling the ground tremble with the approach of soldiers. The fire she had started had drawn more than attention. It had sparked something that could no longer be contained. The conflict between their worlds had found them again, and this time, no amount of silence could hide them. The sound of hooves echoed faintly through the forest, a low rhythmic drum that grew louder with every passing minute. She crouched near the entrance of the cave, clutching the carved token in her hand, the small symbol pressing into her palm like a silent promise. The silent wolf stirred beside the fire, his dark eyes flickering open. He could hear them too. Neither spoke, not with words, not even with signs. The silence between them said enough. The soldiers had found their trail. The morning light filtered through the trees, scattering gold across the damp ground. The forest felt alive, every rustle magnified by fear. She helped him stand, though he moved stiffly, his breath sharp from pain. His shoulder still bore the mark of a bullet that had grazed him during his capture, and every step made his jaw tighten. They had little time. He gestured toward the eastern ridge, the only way out that didn't lead straight into the soldier's path. She nodded, her heart pounding as they began their slow climb through the undergrowth. For hours, they moved like shadows, careful, quiet, listening to every sound. The river's steady murmur was the only comfort left. Somewhere behind them, voices carried faintly, the shouts of men breaking the calm. The soldiers were closing in. But so was something deeper, a reckoning between two worlds that could no longer avoid each other. As they neared the ridge, they found a narrow clearing overlooking the valley. From there, she could see the fort's smoke rising in the distance, and beyond it, the town where she had grown up. She thought of the people there, the same ones, who had smiled at her in church, who now whispered that she had betrayed them. She wondered if they would ever understand what she had done. The silent wolf stopped suddenly and motioned for her to get down. He pointed toward a group of riders crossing below. The soldiers weren't far, their uniforms glinted faintly in the light. But there was another figure with them, one she recognized even from a distance. The sheriff. His coat hung heavy with rain, his face hard with determination. He was leading the hunt himself. They waited until the men disappeared into the trees, then moved again. The path ahead twisted sharply, narrowing between two large rocks. It would be easy to trap someone there. He motioned for her to stay back while he scouted ahead. But before he could take more than a few steps, a gunshot cracked through the air. The bullet struck the rock beside her, sending shards flying, pulling him down with her. Voices shouted nearby. They had been spotted. He grabbed her hand and pulled her through the gap in the rocks, leading her toward the dense trees beyond. The underbrush tore at their clothes, branches whipping across their faces. Behind them, horses crashed through the brush, and the metallic click of rifles echoed closer. She could feel the ground tremble with their pursuit. Her lungs burned. Her legs screamed for rest, but she kept running, refusing to let go of his hand. When they reached the riverbank again, he stopped, scanning their surroundings. The water was high from the recent rains, the current strong. Across the river lay the thick forest that led toward his tribe's territory. It was their only chance. He looked at her and shook his head, gesturing that the water was too dangerous. But she knew what he was thinking. They couldn't stay. Before he could stop her, she stepped into the current. The cold bit deep, stealing her breath. The force of the river nearly swept her away, but he was there, gripping her tightly, pulling her forward. Together they fought the current, each step a struggle against the roaring water. Bullets splashed around them as the soldiers appeared on the opposite bank. She didn't look back. She focused on his eyes, the calm strength in them that seemed to defy the chaos around them. When they finally reached the far side, they collapsed in the mud, gasping for air. The sound of the river drowned out the shouts behind them, but only for a moment. The soldiers would find another way across. They couldn't stop now. The forest on this side was wilder, older, untouched by settlers. The light barely reached the ground, and the air smelled of pine and moss. As they moved deeper, she noticed faint markings on the trees, symbols carved by his people long ago. They were close to the sacred lands he had mentioned before. He looked at her, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. This place was forbidden to outsiders. But she had already crossed every line to reach him. She nodded silently, and they continued. By midday, the rain returned, falling in heavy sheets. They found shelter under a rock ledge, where the sound of rain became a wall around them. He collapsed beside her, exhaustion finally overtaking him. She tore a piece of cloth from her sleeve and began to wrap his shoulder again. Her hands trembled as she worked, not just from fear but from everything she felt, the weight of what they had endured. The unspoken bond between them, and the uncertainty of what awaited them beyond the storm. When she finished, he reached out and caught her wrist gently. His eyes met hers, dark and steady, filled with a question he couldn't voice. She didn't need words to understand. The world outside would never allow this. A settler woman and the son of an Apache. King bound by something deeper than language. But here, in the quiet heart of the wilderness, it felt like the only thing that made sense. Then, a distant horn shattered the moment. The soldiers had found the trail again. He stood, wincing, and grabbed his bow. She could see the shift in him. The quiet man she had known by the river was gone. In his place stood a warrior. He gestured for her to follow and led her up the slope behind the ledge. The path wound sharply until it opened into a plateau overlooking the valley. From there, they could see everything, the burning camp far in the distance, the river twisting like a silver thread, and the faint glint of metal as the soldiers advanced through the trees below. He turned to her. Motioning quickly with his hands, they would have to split up. He would draw the soldiers away while she headed toward his people's hidden village. She refused at first, shaking her head, but his expression left no room for argument. He pressed the carved token into her hand, the same one she had once found on her fence post. Then he pointed toward the horizon, where the storm clouds were gathering again. Before she could reply, the crack of another rifle split the air. The shot missed, but the message was clear. They were surrounded. He signed one final word, "Run." She hesitated only a second, before turning and sprinting toward the ridge. The forest seemed to blur around her, every heartbeat echoing like thunder in her ears. Behind her, the sound of arrows and gunfire mixed in a chaos that twisted her stomach. She wanted to look back, but fear drove her forward. Branches tore at her hair, rain stung her eyes, and the cold mud clung to her boots. Still, she kept going. When she reached the top of the ridge, she turned at last. Through the mist, she saw flashes of movement, soldiers in pursuit, and somewhere among them, his silhouette. He fought like a force of nature, his movements fierce and precise, but there were too many. Her heart broke with every step that carried her farther from him, every sound of struggle that echoed up the hill. Then, from the distance, came a new sound, the deep, steady rhythm of drums. She froze. The forest answered, with voices rising in unison. His people had come, From the shadows emerged warriors on horseback, their cries echoing across the valley. The soldiers hesitated, their line breaking as confusion spread. The silent wolf turned toward the sound, a brief flicker of relief in his eyes, but the battle was inevitable now. The world that had been holding its breath for so long was finally about to explode. She watched in horror as the two sides collided below, the sound of battle roaring through the trees. She wanted to run to him, to stop it all, but her legs wouldn't move. She could only clutch the token against her chest and pray that somehow he would survive the storm that had begun. Lightning split the sky above them, illuminating the chaos in blinding flashes. The rain came harder, washing blood and mud together into the earth. The ridge trembled with the weight of it all. History, anger, love, and loss colliding in one unstoppable moment. And as the thunder rolled across the valley, she whispered into the wind, hoping somehow he could hear her. "Hold on. Please, hold on." But the sound was swallowed by the storm, and the battle below raged on, carrying both their worlds toward a fate neither of them could yet see. The storm finally began to fade, but the echoes of battle still haunted the valley. The air smelled of gunpowder and rain, and the land lay heavy with silence. She moved down from the ridge carefully, her shoes sinking into the soaked ground. The fog drifted low, hiding what she feared to see. The forest that had once seemed endless and alive now felt like a graveyard. Every step brought her closer to the aftermath of what their choices had unleashed. When she reached the clearing, the sight broke her heart. Broken rifles, scattered arrows, and torn flags lay among the trampled grass. The soldiers had retreated, leaving behind their wounded. A few Apache warriors still stood, watching in silence as the smoke cleared. She searched desperately through the haze, her voice hoarse as she called for him. No one answered. Then she saw movement near the edge of the trees, a figure half hidden, struggling to stand. Her breath caught as she ran toward him. He was alive, though barely. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his shoulder bleeding from a deep cut. When she knelt beside him, he looked up, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but filled with recognition. She pressed her hands over the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, tears mixing with the rain. He reached for her wrist, his touch weak but steady, and signed slowly. "You came back." She nodded, unable to speak, her throat too tight. Around them, the warriors began to gather. His father, the Apache king, approached on horseback. His face was stern, but when he saw his son, his eyes softened. The two men exchanged no words, only a long, silent understanding that said everything words could not. Then the king looked at her. For the first time there was no anger in his gaze, only a deep, weary respect. "You saved him," he said quietly. She shook her head. "He saved me," she whispered. "They helped carry him back to the hidden village deep in the canyon, where the tribeswomen tended to the wounded. The journey took hours, but she stayed beside him the whole way, holding his hand as the rain finally stopped. When they reached the camp, the people looked at her with a mix of curiosity and caution. To them, she was still an outsider, a settler, who had crossed every boundary to reach their world. But as she helped wash the blood from his hands, their eyes softened. They could see what bound them was not fear or guilt, but something far greater. Days passed in the quiet of recovery. The battle had ended, but the cost had been high. The soldiers had withdrawn after losing men, and the settlers lived in uneasy silence, unsure what would happen next. The fort stood half empty, its commander replaced, and the sheriff had resigned after being blamed for the failed pursuit. Rumors spread across the frontier. Some said the Apache king had made peace, others claimed revenge would come again. But in truth, both sides had grown tired of endless loss. In the small tent where he rested, she spent each day learning more of his silent language. Her hands no longer stumbled over the signs. They spoke with ease now, entire thoughts shared in gestures and glances. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the red cliffs, he sat beside her and showed her a new sign, two hands interlocking, turning slightly toward the heart. She looked at him in confusion until he smiled softly and made the same, sign again. Together, her heart swelled at the simple beauty of it. There were no vows spoken, no rings, no witnesses. But in that quiet canyon, under the fading light, something sacred passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than any promise. When he was strong enough to walk again, they went to the river, where the tribe gathered for the spring ceremony. His father stood before them all, speaking in his deep, rhythmic tone. Though she didn't know all the words, she could feel the meaning in them, a blessing for peace, for survival, for the next generation to live without hate. Then, to her surprise, he turned toward her and motioned for her to step forward. The tribe fell silent as she approached. The king held out a small object, a carved wooden pendant shaped like an open palm, just like the token she had once found on her fence post. "You understand our ways," he said slowly, his English rough but steady. "You speak with hands, not fear. My son's heart chose you. So you belong to this land now if you choose it." Her eyes filled with tears as she accepted the pendant. It was more than a gift, it was acceptance. Around them, the people nodded in quiet approval. The silent wolf stood beside her, pride glowing faintly in his calm expression. For the first time, he was not the outcast, not the mute son of the Apache king. He was a bridge between two worlds, and she was part of that bridge too. In the weeks that followed, the valley began to heal. The settlers and the Apache agreed to trade peacefully again, guided by cautious hope rather than old wounds. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. She often returned to the river where it had all begun, the place where she first spoke to him with her hands. The water still ran clear and strong, carrying away the remnants of everything they had survived. Sometimes, as they sat together by the water's edge, she would trace her fingers through the current. Remembering how different their lives had once been, he would smile, watching her with quiet affection, then draw a symbol in the sand, two paths meeting in one circle. She asked once what it meant. He signed slowly, his gestures deliberate. Two worlds. One heart. It wasn't a fairy tale. The world around them remained harsh and uncertain. There were still those who looked at them with suspicion, both among her people and his. But they no longer needed approval. They had found something stronger than fear understanding as summer came. She helped the tribe rebuild the trading post near the valley edge. The settlers who passed through often paused, surprised to see her there, working side by side with those they once called enemies. Some avoided her, others nodded respectfully. But one evening, an old woman from town approached, offering her a small basket of bread. "Your father would have been proud," she said softly. "He always believed this land was meant for sharing, not fighting." The words stayed with her long after the woman left. She thought of her father, of the stories he used to tell by the fire about unity and courage. She wondered if somewhere beyond this life he was watching, proud of the choice she had made. The silent wolf stood nearby, his shadow stretching across the golden grass. She walked toward him, holding the pendant at her chest. "Do you ever think it will last?" she asked quietly, signing the words as she spoke them. He looked at her for a long time before replying. His hands moved slowly, gracefully. "Peace is like the river," he signed. "It bends, it breaks, it returns. But it always finds its way." She smiled at that. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers through the valley, and the sound of laughter drifted from the nearby village. The world wasn't perfect, but it was alive again. They had both been changed by war, by silence, by love, and that change had rippled outward, touching everything around them as the sun set behind the cliffs. She leaned against him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her hand. The river glimmered in the fading light, and the land seemed to breathe again. They stood there for a long time, two souls bound not by words, by understanding. And when the night finally fell, the stars appeared above the valley, bright and endless. The same stars that had watched over them through every storm now shone quietly on their peace. The land that once divided them had become their home, and though history would remember battles and borders, it would never tell the truest part of the story that somewhere in the heart of the frontier, a woman and a silent warrior had spoken to each other with their hands, and in doing so, taught two worlds how to listen.